The Greeks were different from the ancient peoples in two ways. Number one, they had a form of democracy. And number two, they had among them some religious skeptics. Eventually, they had philosophers who said, as for whether the gods exist or not, I don't know if they even exist. You don't find that in the ancient world, but you do find that among the Greeks. Now, let me hasten to say they were not all religious skeptics. It is well known among the Greeks that anywhere from 90 to 95% of them believed in the gods, but that's down from 100% you have among other ancient peoples before their time. Now, as for the democracy, we'll be talking more about that. I think that one thing that contributed to their democracy was Greece had a bunch of city-states. In other words, these city-states were whole states, but consist of just one city. A city-state was, the word was polis. That's why we have words in among our cities like Minneapolis, P-O-L-I-S. I've written that out in cursive as a foreign word. Yeah, the polis. In other words, the metropolis, I know that's a fictional name, but my great-grandfather is buried in Coriopolis, Polis. The polis was a city and the surrounding countryside. The surrounding countryside was where the people grew the crops that kept the people in the city alive. And the city was where they had their tanners, their weavers, their shoemakers, their blacksmiths and whatever, and their government officials and their scholars inside the city. Now, each of these city-states was surrounded by tall, rugged mountains that made it really difficult for one city to invade another. For one city to invade, they'd have to climb, I'm exaggerating, a steep mountain, then climb back down the other side of the mountain. And during that time, some of them would fall, trip, lose their equipment, drop their fighting equipment, whatever. By the time they got to the other side, the army was much weaker than it started out. So it meant that the side that was defending itself could much more readily defend itself. So they had a bunch of city-states. Greece is small and the mountains are rugged. The climate is moderate, but the land is very rocky and not really good for farming. Now, as for democracy, I'll have more to say about that later. Essentially, the Greek democracy, the experience they had with it was so bad that Western Europeans did not adopt much democracy for hundreds of years after the Greeks. Well, the Greeks tried it, and it failed them. The Romans tried it, and it failed them. Does not speak well of democracy. And Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, all three of the philosophers, had a really, really low view of democracy. The Greeks had a view of science, and some of them studied science, and they tried to figure out the size of the earth. Now, they knew the earth was a sphere. They knew the earth was round. But they would try to figure out how far the earth was from the sun and how far the earth was from the moon by using triangulation. They are famous for their supposed invention of geometry. I say supposed invention because a lot of people believe that they got the geometry from the Egyptians. But they would try to reason out the size of the solar system, the distance between the Earth and Moon, the Earth and Sun. Unfortunately, their instruments were not accurate and their figures were far wrong. But some of them actually had a view of life that we might call evolutionary, that life came from other life forms very similar to the theory of evolution. Evolution was not invented by Darwin. Some Greeks had studied it long before. Now, it is believed that the very ancient Greeks were united when they first came down from the north. In other words, in about 1800 BCE or thereabouts, a bunch of people, Indo-Europeans, came down from the north, and the Greeks went on. To the west came the Latins, and they became the Romans that we hear about later. And then, of course, the Greeks settled in Greece. To the East of the Greeks were the Persians, and then to the east of them were the Aryans. All of these people began to move at the same time, possibly influenced by a global cooling, or a cooling that occurred that forced these people from their original homelands to move south to warmer climates. Because in all cases they moved south and they conquered the peoples they found living at ease or settled lives. Anyway, as they moved and settled, they initially were united. They spoke a common language and worshiped the same gods. Then they fell apart, and they were destined to not be reunited again until Alexander the Great's father, now not Alexander himself, but his father, Philip of Macedon, was to unite them after many generations. Philip, yeah, the man, all right, we'll get to him. The man who united them was Philip of Macedon, and he was an outsider. The Macedonians were related to the Greeks, but they were not Greek. Macedonia, and then after Philip came Alexander the Great, whom we have already mentioned in connection with India. We will mention him again, of course, as we get farther into Greek studies. Now, the earliest civilization, folk, that we know about among the Greeks was the Minoan. The Minoan civilization lived in the area that today we call the Aegean Sea. And of course, if you look on a map, you'll find the Aegean Sea is just off the coast of Greece. It's part of the Mediterranean Sea. Back when I was in 6th grade, they called it the Aegean civilization, but today's your authors call it the Minoan civilization. We don't know much about them. What we know about them comes from archaeology. They had written records. Their written records have not been deciphered, again, owing to the fact that we don't have enough of them. These people appear to have been, now folk, this is a theme that I'm going to be hitting, and I've asked you to watch for this. They appear to have been very wealthy and very prosperous. Like the people of the Indus Valley, where they were all equal. These people were wealthy, they were seagoing people. Most of the artifacts you find in their homes came from somewhere else, could not have come from the area around Greece. They traded. The economy apparently was based on trade, and a lot of what we find in their cities, a lot of what they manufactured, we find elsewhere, particularly in Egypt. They seem to have had a lot of trade with Egypt. Now, here's the big mystery. These people were wealthy, they were traders, and their civilization came to an abrupt end. They're gone. It is believed that a huge tidal wave might have wiped out the island of Crete, and a tidal wave just overthrown the whole island of Crete and left behind nothing but stone ruins, and destroyed all the crops, all the people, and all the animals, and left the island destitute of life. And folk, just as recently as 15 hours ago, I was watching a YouTube video that said the story of the Minoan civilization might have been the basis for the story of Atlantis that we'll talk about later in connection with Plato. That according to Plato's account, Atlantis fell into the sea. It is known that in this time of history, tidal waves were worse than they are now. Earthquakes were tended to be worse than they are now. And apparently there were more big rocks falling from the sky, meteorites and comets, small asteroids, than there are now. And folk, while I'm on the subject, some of you might be aware, a meteorite made news. Fell in somewhere in India and killed a person. It's the first time a meteorite has been blamed for the death of a human since 1825. But some of the accounts say the first time in history. But a meteorite hit Russia back in 2013, so it seems like they're following more frequency. A meteorite hit Siberia in 1908, or it might have been a comet, something huge hit Siberia in 1908. And when I was a kid, I used to read a lot of astronomy books, and these astronomers in the 1950s would say, there's not much danger because the Earth is just like a small speck of dust, and these meteorites even smaller, and a chance of one of them colliding. Then we got more knowledge, better telescopes. We go, hey, there are millions of these bodies rotating around the sun close to Earth. And the odds of us being hit by one is about 1 in every 100 years. Well, we were hit by one in 1908, another one in 2013, and it looks like another one hit just a couple days ago. Is anybody hear what I'm talking about? One head is nodding at least. Yeah, but
No.
anyway, we don't know why at this time in history there would have been more meteorites, more volcanoes, more earthquakes, and more tsunamis. Otherwise, the word tidal wave and tsunami is synonymous. Whatever, the civilization apparently came to a sudden end. The Minoans were replaced by the Mycenaeans. By the way, the Minoans were not Greek. Then came the Mycenaeans. Let's see. M-Y-C-E-N-A-E-A-N. The Mycenaeans we used to think were not Greek, but now we know they were. They came probably around 1800 or 1900 BC. Again, as far as Minoans, we have no idea where they came from. But the Mycenaeans came down from farther north. What was left of the Minoan civilization they conquered, they, again, like other Indo-European peoples, they found everywhere they went, they found what we call an indigenous population, people living there already, whom they took care of, subjugated. And these people may have been the ones who destroyed Troy, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But folk, we've learned that they were Greek. All right.
It destroyed Troy?
They may have destroyed Troy, these Mycenaeans, according to Homeric legends. But that's jumping around the story a little bit. I'll get to Troy in a couple minutes. But they, the reason we know they were Greek. All right, I'm going to back up a bit. World War II, a lot of British cryptographers were trying to crack the German codes and the Japanese codes. But when the war was over, by the way, we cracked the German and Japanese code. And we were able to listen in on German conversations and on Japanese conversations. Now, I was in the Army for a while, and I can tell you something. Our government changes its code every day. If the enemy gets the code today, tomorrow it's going to be changed. And because the government never knows from one day to the next what code it's going to put out. You know, so we've learned that it's the Germans and the Japanese both use the same code during the entire war, thinking that it's not being decided. Well, when the war was over, these cryptographers turned their attention to some ancient writings. And one of them, Michael Ventris by name, and don't worry about it, discovered that the Mycenaeans were Greek. They wrote in a script, and my very first graduate paper was on this, called Linear B. And because we had a whole lot of Linear B text, written, I believe, on stone. So we had a lot of them. We were able to decipher it, especially when Michael Ventris figured out, hey, this is Greek. And since we knew the Greek language, well, he could read the entire text, and after a while, hey, we made a big discovery. Linear B is Greek. Now, obviously, you might say, is there a linear A? Yes, there is. But the problem with linear A is that my first paper was written about linear A, because some man claimed to have deciphered it, but 45 years after I wrote the paper, I've checked recently, linear A has not been deciphered, and it may never be, owing to the fact we just do not have enough script written in linear A. Again, we find a big cache or big cave full of linear A script, we might decipher it. But whatever linear A was, linear B was Greek, and it proved that the Mycenaeans were in fact Greek. Now, the Mycenaean people came, even though they were Greek, their civilization came to an end, and the Greeks entered a period called the Dark Age. I mean, you know, mankind seems to go up and down sometimes in civilization. He's civilized, and his civilization comes to an end. Then he revives his civilization again, and his civilization comes to an end again. These Greeks went through a period that we call the Dark Age. And we call it a Dark Age because we don't have very many written records. However, late in this period of the Dark Age, there was a Greek poet named Homer. That's a blind poet. Now, before I get to Homer, though, Homer wrote using the Greek script, which the Greeks had learned from Phoenicians. All right, the Greeks originally wrote in Linear B, but then came the Phoenicians, and they gave them phonetics, or an alphabetical script. And the Greeks said, hey, this is better than what we're using to write. So the Greeks adopted the Greek letters, letters that look like this, this. If you're in a fraternity, you might be familiar with some of these letters. These are some of the Greek letters, Omicron, Theta, Epsilon, Beta. Any of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, a few of your heads, several heads are nodding. Okay, yeah. But anyway, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet, and Homer used the Phoenician alphabet to write two poems, the Iliad, and you may notice I'm writing these in cursive because they are foreign words, and the Odyssey. The Iliad describes a 10-year-long Trojan war between Greece and a city called Troy. And for a long time, nobody knew what to make of these stories because these stories, like all other ancient writings, involve supernatural events, involve the gods, involve a hero who is capable of changing his shape into an animal and then back into a human again, and involve a hero who is invulnerable named Achilles. Achilles, all right, this is getting into Greek literature, but I'll tell the story now. Greeks were famous for their tragedies. A tragedy is a story where, if you remember from your literature classes, where the hero dies. In the case of Achilles, when he was born, some soothsayer said he's going to die in battle. Well, his mother was determined it wouldn't happen, so his mother went to the gods, and the gods said, dip him into the river Styx, and he'll become invulnerable. So she dipped all of them into the river Styx, except he held onto his heel, and his heel was not submerged in the river Styx, and she pulled him back up. And Achilles fought for many years, unable to be hurt, but one day he stepped on a stone and his heel bled, and somebody got to go, hey, if I shoot a poison arrow at his heel, he'll die. So this person shot a poison arrow at Achilles' heel. The arrow went in and poisoned him, and he died just like was foretold. In the Greek tragedies, the hero died because fate had willed it, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I am not in any way implying that this is right, but nevertheless, this is what the Greeks and the Chinese believe. They called fate the inevitability. What will be, and we can do nothing about it. It's sometimes called fatalism. But anyway, and all these are part of the stories of Troy. Zeus's jealous wife, Hera, the Romans called her Juno, became very involved in a fight and took up sides, first one side and another. Well, finally, the Greeks triumphed when they told the Trojans, you've won, we can't whip you. This was after 10 years of war. We're going to give you a gift, a wooden horse. So the people of Troy wheeled the wooden horse inside their city, unaware that inside were Greek soldiers. In the meantime, the other Greek soldiers pretended that they were marching away from the city, but they only went out of sight and they stopped their march. When darkness fell, the soldiers inside the horse got out of the horse, opened up the gates to let their buddies inside. The Greeks then set the city of Troy on fire. And that was the end of the Trojan War, with Troy destroyed. Now, one thing that helps us make this sort of believable was in the late 1700s, an archaeologist got to studying extensively. I mean, now it took him so many days to get to Troy. He started from here, and he traveled it, and he eventually was able to pinpoint where he believed the city was located, started digging around here and found the city of Troy, which was certain was actually Troy. And Troy was inhabited and destroyed several times. The last time it was inhabited was in fact destroyed by fire.
So the wooden horses were still found?
The wooden horse we never found, but after about, what, 2,700 years, the wood would have decomposed, and burnt wood would have decomposed not just to ash but to dust. So we never found the wooden horse. But the wooden horse would have been burned up in the fire, along with everything else that was wooden. Anyway, this makes at least part of the story believable. But I had a skeptic when I was in high school, the same one who said that he didn't believe the story of the Red Sea parties. I don't believe that. I'm a preacher's kid. He told the whole class, oh yeah, there was something to it, but after a while they exaggerated. After a while gods got involved, and in other words, in my day we were taught that there was a natural explanation for everything and the supernatural did not exist. And some of us tried to discuss this with my science teacher one time, and he was a confirmed naturalist. He'd say, oh, that was just coincidence, that was just coincidence. All right, you can believe what you want to about these things. But anyway, the Odyssey, on the other hand, now that's where the Ulysses, we had a president named Ulysses, but anyway, where the Ulysses went home from Troy to go back to Greece. The whole trip took many years, but initially his ship was blown off course and he went to all kinds of places, including lands of giants, the land of the Amazons, where the women were the boss and the women were the only soldiers and the men were the slaves. These were the Amazons. And I did read an article one time about 30 years ago where that a person said he actually believed the account told in the Odyssey. He believed that what happened was a ship got blown off by a storm so bad, much worse than the storm today, that it wound up in South America. And that some of this stuff can be believed if you believe that he went from South America through Africa on his way back home and then eventually found his way back to Greece through lands that today do not exist anymore. You can believe what you want to believe. Now, I've got to ask, how many of you have run into these stories in your literature classes or in okay, just a few hands are going up, maybe about 1/3 of you or so. Anyway, these stories, all right. What these stories tell us is that the Greeks valued highly courage and also a thing called arete, which is where the word arete can be translated as virtue or courage. But there's no good, I mean, a lot of these Greek words do not have a good English translation. For instance, it was said that one of the soldiers' horses possessed arete. Well, we don't think of horses possessing virtue. So again, when you study the Greek language, and a lot of people have, owing to the fact that the New Testament was written in Greek, some of these words that the Greeks used do not have an exact English translation. And arete, but they valued courage, honor, but one thing they did not have was the value of cooperation or the value of community among all of them. They valued loyalty to the city-state, but not loyalty to the Greeks. And both we experienced this during our own Civil War, where that men like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, at least Stonewall Jackson was hard against slavery, but he said, I'm loyal to my state first and my country second. So he's fought on the southern side. Lee, you could pretty much say the same thing for state first, country second. The Greeks, all of them had this attitude. My city-state is first, the polis comes first, my nation comes second. All right. Also, yeah, this was an age in which you had aristocratic social classes, and they ruled. Aristocratic values ruled. Again, we do not know how much we can believe about the Iliad and Odyssey. These stories are known as, sometimes they're known as myths, but more likely they're known as legends. The difference between a myth and a legend, legends usually involve heroes. The gods are there, but the heroes are the main characters of the story. In the case of the myths, myths describe the creation of the world and what the world was presumed to be like before the gods came along. All right. The polis. I've already touched on the polis a little bit. The city, it consists of a town and a countryside. Oftentimes the town had walls. Each local polis had its own patron god or goddess. Now the main ones. For Athens, their main goddess was Athena. Because the Athenians pride themselves on wisdom, Athena was a goddess of wisdom. For Corinth, their main goddess was Aphrodite. The Romans called her Venus. If you look at the sky in the morning or evening, you'll see the bright, really bright star that's bright in all of those is probably the planet Venus. Venus was associated with fertility, with sex, with marriage. Sometimes called the goddess of love and beauty. Corinth was her city. Sparta, the land of soldiers, the city of soldiers. Their favorite god was Ares. The Romans called him Mars. Each city-state had its own patron deity. Aristotle said every citizen belongs to the state. He doesn't belong to himself. Now, the polis, though, kept the Greeks from uniting, just like the attitude the southern people had toward the state before the country almost divided our country. I mean, hey, a lot of countries about that time were divided. Holland used to be a big country, but then it split into Holland and Belgium, and they've never been the same since. But the Greeks instituted a new military system called the Hoplite phalanx. Now, Hoplite was, it varied from time to time, place to place, but they figured out a way that they could fight without losing a whole lot of their men. And the way they did it, they lined up shoulder to shoulder. Now again, for purposes of this illustration, I'm going to pretend I'm right-handed. Actually, I'm left-handed. But the soldiers who were right-handed would put their left arm out to protect, not themselves. Each person used his shield to protect his buddy or the person next to him. And in turn, he was protected by the person who was on his right. So basically, they fought as a team. So he would fight with one hand on his sword, the other hand protecting his neighbor. And then in his turn, his neighbor would fight protecting him. You could not fight one of them individually. You had to fight the whole team. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. You might have heard American Indians being called braves or even warriors, but American Indians were never called soldiers. Anybody know why? What's the difference?
Organization.
What's that?
Organization.
Organization. Soldiers fight as a team. When the Indians got to fight, one job is another. An Indian, typical Indian would look around and, I wonder who's about my size. I'll pick on this fellow. He looks like he's my size. And they'd fight one-on-one until one of them had finished off the other. Then the one who won would look around. Now, who else can I see to fight? Well, they started fighting against the trained American army, and they did not fare very well. It wasn't because they didn't have guns. I mean, after a few years, the American Indians got the guns and learned how to use them. They got the horses and learned how to use them, but they didn't have the organization, number one, and number two, they didn't have the numbers either. They were hopelessly outnumbered. But back to this time, we were talking about the Greeks learned to fight in a formation. Now, this way of fighting only worked when every soldier could hear the commands of his officer. As armies got bigger and bigger, eventually this way of fighting had to fall by the wayside. But now, the Hoplites, in order to get the common people to fight, the aristocracy had to give in to the people to give them certain rights. And this was to lead to democracy, in that the common people began to demand more rights and to get more rights. Now, as I've already mentioned, Greece was a bad land as far as farming. Very rocky, very hilly. The mountains were steep. So a lot of the Greeks began to fan out and colonize. They moved across the sea to Asia Minor, what we call today Turkey. And a lot of the people living in Turkey were Greeks. They also moved west into Italy, and some of them moved into North Africa, but they began to fan out all over the place and spread out. And they wound up finding, you could find Greeks all over the Mediterranean world after a time. And a lot of it was, most of the colonists were people who did not have any success in the motherland back in Greece. So they would up and move. I mean, we did the same thing in our country. people who were poor or downtrodden or having to work long hours in factories, or finding their farms just could not produce, or finding that their older brothers had taken over their inheritance and they didn't have any inheritance left. They just simply pack up everything into a wagon and move west. And this is a story of our country's history where the Greeks did the same thing. They began to fan out all over the Mediterranean area. And this is going to become important later. Keep this in mind, because this explains how Greece got involved in wars with the Persians and how eventually they got involved in wars with the Romans. Now, the Greeks began to experience change in their government. Generally, their government started out as a monarchy. M-O-N-A-R-C-H-Y. Monarchy means divine right king, where the king rules until he dies and his oldest son takes over. That's the basic idea behind a monarchy, as opposed to a dictatorship where the most powerful man takes over. The monarchy would eventually give way after a while to an aristocracy. When people got tired of the monarchy, the richer people, the aristocracy means the rich rule. The rich would get together in a council and they would decide. The aristocracy, after a while, it would lead to chaos, and it would give way to a tyranny. Now, we think of the word tyrant. The word tyrant has a bad connotation in today's world, but in the Greek time, it did not necessarily mean bad. A tyrant was a person who took over, not because he was born into it, but because he was more powerful than anybody else and brushed aside. Usually took over in a coup. The word coup means he killed the person in power and took over himself. Now, after a while, when the people got tired of the tyranny, a form of democracy would come along. Now, if you notice, I put the word monarchy on top and democracy at the bottom. I did this on purpose, not because I necessarily believe it's this way, but this is the way that some of the Greek philosophers came to believe. They said the worst form of government you can have is democracy. The best form is an enlightened monarch or a good king. The problem with a tyranny was if a person took over, he oftentimes was filled with pride. In contrast, your monarch knew, hey, I got to be king because I was born into it. It's not because of my ability, not because I earned it, but I was born into it. So he might be a little bit less prideful. Aristocracy, generally they were the hereditary rich. But these things went around in cycles, starting out with one person, a few people, then one person again, then the whole masses. Then after democracy led to complete and total utter chaos, they would oftentimes go to a demagoguery, where a powerful demagogue would take over and he would bring order out of the chaos. Now, someone said, we don't know who said it, but he said democracy will only work until the common people find out that they can dip their hand into the public pot. This went on even in the Greeks, when the Greeks would vote themselves money from the public treasury with a feeling that this money should be taken from the rich, and the rich should redistribute their wealth among the poor. And everybody would be equal and everybody would be happy. Well, eventually, when democracy failed, the demagogue would take over. And he would put a stop to the nonsense and basically tell the poor people, hey, now, you're going to have to pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps. You cannot rob from the rich anymore. The rich have already been robbed bare. Folk, I'll say this. I mean, I attended a snake show when I was first married. This man said he had a pet snake at home. He said, I also have a dog. Like there was one and the same. But he was handling these rattlesnakes. He milked them because the hospitals needed snake venom to help cure people who are snake bitten. So he would sell the venom to hospitals. The venom only lasts so long. Somebody might know what I'm talking about. He said this about the snakes, and we hate them. And the first thing we do when we see one is kill it. He said, one of these days, they're all going to be gone. And as much as we hate them, we're going to miss them when they're all gone. The rich have been called snakes. But if we ever destroy the rich folk, we all go down into poverty in a pile. Let the rich get as rich as the rich can get, because the richer they get, the richer I'll get. Yeah, sure. I'm not questioning that, but let them be what they are. Sooner or later, they're going to want to spend their money, and when they do, the rest of us will benefit. It's the rich who hire people. The rich eventually want to spend their money. But anyway, just take the money from the rich, and the whole economy comes crashing down. All right, if any of you disagree with that, huh?
I'm like big industry.
What's that?
Big industry.
Big industry, yeah, well, that's one example, yeah, to take it. And redistribution, all right. The Greeks dealt with that issue. The demagogues would come along and say, all right, no more free handouts. And in effect, the whole cycle would start all over again. And speaking of free handouts, yes, on a personal note, I'm collecting Social Security, and I hear rumors everyone's about that the Social Security system is almost bankrupt and about to come to an end. Medicare would be bankrupt already if it went back up to the federal government. Handouts. And for those of you who are much younger than I am, which looks like most of you are, I shudder to think of what will happen. I can pretty well guarantee you Social Security will not be there for you when you come to be my age. I'll turn 67 in June, but I don't mind telling you how old I am. I'll turn 67 in June. Yeah, I'm 66. All right, anyway. All right, now we come to two cities. These two cities are Athens and Sparta. We're going to elaborate on them a little bit. Now, when I was a youngster studying history, the conflict between Athens and Sparta reminded me of the conflict between the United States and Soviet Union, with Sparta being the Soviet Union and Athens being the United States. We'll turn it in a little bit. You might understand why I would compare Sparta to the Soviet Union and Athens to the United States. Now, I want to jump ahead of the story a little bit. In the short run, in the fight between these two, in the fight, Sparta won the initial fight. And that bothered me. Did that mean that the Soviet Union was going to whip the United States? Well, there is no Soviet Union anymore, but there is Russia. And in some ways, right now, they have more involved than they once did. They were more involved than we did. I don't know. You can't predict the future. Well, I'll tell you in the past, Sparta won. Now, I say Sparta won the initial conflict, but now fast forward to 2016. Athens has at least 2 million people. As for Sparta, it's nothing but a bunch of rocks where the city once stood. Some people grazed their goats and their sheep among the rocks. There were 200 people who lived at the top of the mountains who claimed to be descended from the Spartans. They really are. Sparta today is a ghost town. So in the long run, Sparta died. In the long run, Athens won. In the short run, Athens lost and suffered terribly. All right, what was the difference? Well, we'll start off with Sparta. Sparta did not have a seacoast. It was in the Peloponnese area. That's why I call them Peloponnesian. The Peloponnese area of Greece. Yeah, the Peloponnese. Now, we'll keep this word in mind because we're going to talk about the Peloponnesian War, which Sparta won. It's called Peloponnesian War because it was a war that Athens fought against Sparta. But Sparta was in the Peloponnesian region of Greece, and it was very unfertile. So, in order to survive, they felt like they had to conquer a more wealthy city-state nearby. So they conquered a people nearby called the Helots. Weirdly enough, the Helots claimed to be descended from Hercules. And you know the story of Hercules. He married once, and his first wife and all of his children died, but then he married again. And from his second marriage came a bunch of people who lived in the city of Messenia. And Messenia, these people became slaves to the Spartans, and the words Helot as used here means Spartan slave. So the Spartans then enslaved the Messenians, called them Helots, and they forced the Helots to provide food for the Spartans. And this went on for a few hundred years. The Spartans then converted themselves into one big military camp because they were afraid the Helots were going to rise up against them. So everybody in Sparta, from the king to the lowest, were soldiers. All right, here's the bad news. A child, whether it be boy or girl, born to Spartan parents, the parents were allowed to keep this child for 1 month. After 1 month, the parents were expected to take this child into a Spartan doctor, and the doctor would examine the child. If the doctor deemed the child to be healthy, this child was allowed to grow up. If the doctor said this child was not healthy, the parents were expected to take this child out into a deserted area, drop him off, and leave him to be beaten up by wild animals. This is called exposing babies. Now, by the way, the practice of exposing babies we're going to run into again in the study of Rome. But basically, the Spartans only allowed their seemingly best and strongest to grow up. They did not allow any kind of intermingling with anyone else because they said, we are the superior people and everybody else inferior, so they did not want their people visiting other Greek states, and they did not encourage visitors to come to them. And Spartan men were only allowed to marry Spartan women. Now, what they did not realize, well, what this led to was eventually bad genes came in, as is the case of all inbreeding, and especially when they killed off a high percentage of the population. Well, it wasn't just that they killed off the babies. A Spartan man started his soldier training when he was 6, and the training oftentimes killed a high percentage of Spartan males during the training. The training was very rigorous and rough, and oftentimes the person just could not stand up to it. He gets sick, get pneumonia, or else gets killed in the games, or permanently crippled in their games, so become useless. The bottom line was, if I could go back to Sparta and advise, hey, what you need to do is tell your men to collect themselves wives from Persia, from Spain, from North Africa, from Scandinavia, and even from far off China. And that way you might create a race of super warriors. And tell your women to marry men from well, China, India, and Africa, and anywhere they can find, or anywhere else besides Sparta. And that way you might create a race of super warriors. But if you just keep inbreeding among yourselves, after a while you're going to become super weaklings, which is exactly what they became after a short time. I mean, a few generations. But they thought themselves as better than everybody else, and a lot of royalty has done this. The Merovingian dynasty, we'll talk about in France, only married other Merovingians, so these Merovingian kings would marry their first cousins, with the result that they only lived about 20 years and were very sickly and unhealthy and mentally deficient during their whole reigns, and after a while the line became extinct. The Spartans had to live in constant fear that the Messenians would revolt, and eventually the Messenians successfully revolted, owing to the fact that the Spartans allowed the Messenians to populate like crazy. And after a while, the Messenians outnumbered to 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, and 6 to 1. Then Messenians got help. That's jumping ahead of the story a little bit, but eventually the Spartans had to give up soldiering and turn to another way of making a living, so they turned to acting. Yeah, oh yes. There's something else that kept the Spartan population down was the Spartan men were not allowed to live at home. They had to live back until they turned 30. They might marry, but they, in order to visit your wives, before they were 30, they had to sneak off. Well, finally, when they turned 30, they were allowed to live at home. And needless to say, they and their wives lost some of their best childbearing years. All this kept the Spartan population way down. Then the Spartans passed a law that the parents had to pay for their children's education. And a lot of Spartan couples just said, we can't afford this. They said they practiced birth control or abortion or infanticide and didn't have children. If that weren't enough, there came a big earthquake that killed 25,000 Spartans and didn't even hurt the Messenians. The earthquake only hit the city of Sparta. So all this depleted the population, but before it depleted them, the Spartans were able to almost conquer all of Greece. Sparta, though, has a distinction of being one of the few places on earth that never experienced any kind of coup, never experienced revolt or rebellion. It was like their men and women were just programmed from the beginning. Now, as for the women were trained to be desensitized, and as their husbands left, they wouldn't hug them and kiss them and say, I hope you return. They would tell them, now come back either with your shield or on it. In other words, on it meant you're dead, but to come back either dead or alive, come back a hero if you're or don't come back at all. To help desensitize the women, the young girls were expected to parade up the streets completely nude in front of the crowd. This was supposedly to desensitize them to the horrors of war, the horrors of possibly losing your husband. Again, each of you can make up your minds for yourself what you think about this, but Spartan boys, every boy was whipped in public in front of everybody at least once a year, again, to desensitize him also. Whipping was a big part of Spartan training. The Spartan lawgiver was a man named Lycurgus. Lycurgus, and in the middle of that word Curgus, so there's the word cur, which means dog. Some people believe that Lycurgus was really just a symbol for a dog and not really a person. Others say that, anyway, Lycurgus supposedly believed in a system that, well, if any of you have ever read Huxley's Brave New World in 1984, where a person was programmed from the time he was born. Have any of you ever read or heard of any of those books, 1984 or Brave New World? Yeah, what are these doing like? Where the person was programmed from the time they were born, and they were made slaves of the state, mental and physical slaves, and everybody was a slave, including the king and the generals. All right, so much for Sparta for the time being. Now we move on to Athens. We know at the very beginning Athens was a monarchy. But the monarchy fell into disrepair at time, and then the records become scarce. When the records start again, they start with a man named Solon. That word I've heard it pronounced Solon or Solon. Essentially, what was happening in Athens was they were going through a period of economic hardship. An Athenian man might find himself really deep in debt, and to satisfy the debts, he would have to put himself, basically sell himself as a slave, or he might get away with selling his son or daughter as a slave to use as collateral. So a whole lot of Athenians were being forced into slavery. Well, into this scenario came Solon. Some people believe that Solon, like so many of the other great Athenian wise men, went to Egypt to get his ideas. But anyway, the aristocrats and the common people, the poor and rich, were fighting each other, and they wanted someone who could solve the problems. Well, in came Solon, and he worked out a deal. He said, okay, here's what we'll do. Nobody may use himself as collateral for a debt anymore. Nobody may use humans as collateral. You can't use your son or daughter as collateral. He also said that anybody who was made a slave because of being in debt was to be freed. Now that did not apply to persons who had been made a slave because of some crime they committed or some atrocity they committed that made them more or less perhaps deserving of slavery. But anyone who had fallen too deep into debt to pay, he would say they're at least free, and he'll try to collect the money from them the best way you can. All right, this was great for the poor people, and this dissatisfied the rich. But where he didn't satisfy the poor, he did not redistribute. He did not take the land from the rich and give to the poor. Now, folk, this has been a problem throughout all of history. You'll find people who settle a certain area and they all divide up the land equally. And after a while, this person will fall on hard times and have to sell his land. This man will be wounded in battle and have to sell his land. And this man will become sick and have to sell his land. Or this man will have some financial reverses due to maybe an illness family. And after a while, the rich get all the land and the poor have nothing. Now, in our country, we've tried to keep that problem from happening by, if you buy a property, you'd better go to the courthouse right away and get what's called a homestead exemption. The homestead exemption means you pay much less taxes if you're not living in a house or if the house you buy is not being lived in. You're going to have to pay taxes so bad that you want to get rid of the property. It's called a homestead exemption. And the same way with farmland. If you're farming the land, you can go to the county and get a farmer's exemption. And the farmer's going to move your taxes way down. If the government finds out that nobody is using that land, they'll find the owner and they will tax him really high. It encourages our landowners to get rid of land that they're not using and put it on the market for whatever it'll bring. The Jews had a system whereby every 50 years all the land returned back to its original owner. They called it Jubilee. And a lot of economic experts say, hey, this was a great idea. But a big problem has been the rich get all the wealth after a while and the poor are left out. Well, the poor wanted Solon to take this land from the rich and redistribute it. To his credit, Solon did not. I don't know what made him wise enough, but folk, every time in history it's been done, it has never worked. You can explain to me why. I mean, but in Solon's case, he didn't. He did not take the land from the rich, did not redistribute it among the poor. Now, both sides did not like Solon at first. The changes appeared to be a compromise. The rich did not like it because he took away their slaves. The poor did not like it because he did not give them land. Solon finally retired from public life. And folk, I had an uncle one time, my father's sister's husband, who sat in my father's living room one day and he said, I tell you, politics is a dirty business. And he finally retired from politics and died shortly thereafter. But leaving that, Solon got tired of being at the top and he retired. Everybody hated him first, and then after he was gone, they couldn't honor him enough. They said, hey, this man was a great statesman after all. Sounds like the way the Chinese treated their philosophers and the Jews treated a lot of their religious leaders. And once he's gone, hey, they can't heap up enough honors on him. I mean, in our own country, Abe Lincoln, while he was alive, was called an idiot, an imbecile, and a whole lot of other uncomplimentary things. Then when he died, we couldn't honor him enough. Same way with Solon. After he was gone, Athens experienced a period of prosperity. As for these poor people who didn't get their land, they finally decided, hey, the government is not going to bail us out. We're going to have to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps and lift ourselves up out of this poverty. It worked. After Solon, the next statesman was Pisistratus. Now, he was what Solon did not want. He was a tyrant. That doesn't mean he was a bad tyrant. But he took over when the power vacuum ended. Solon wanted someone to be democratically elected. Instead, the strong man got an army, got the soldiers on his side and took over. But he ruled well, and he's looked on as a statesman. He was in the line between Solon and Pericles. When Pisistratus died, there was a power struggle of sorts. Pisistratus tried to put his son in, but his son could not manage. Eventually, the next man was Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes paved the way for the democracy that was to come later. For one thing, he found that the people of Athens were dividing themselves into tribes based on birth. Well, the problem was some tribes became really large and some became small. And after a while, most of the people found themselves in the small tribes. It's just not fair. We just don't have a chance. So Cleisthenes said, okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide everybody in Athens by lottery into 10 tribes. Well, yeah, 10 tribes. And the old tribal loyalties, you must be loyal to your new tribe. So he threw out lots, you might say rolled dice. And the persons whose number came up for number 1 went to tribe 1 and so on until everybody was assigned to one of the 10 tribes, and all 10 tribes were equal in size. That way no tribe would be more powerful than another. This created somewhat more of an equality than there had been before. He also set up, and this is something else that we're going to run into later, he organized the council. Now this council of 500 would be the people who made the laws. It consists of 500 men. And yes, I have to say men, folk, because the Greeks were not ready to let women into the government. Not yet, anyway. But this Council of 500, now, the Council of 500 eventually got a bad name because this was the council that eventually condemned Socrates to death. But these were 500 of Athens' leading citizens who voted in, and it became something like a republic. And it was something like our Congress. Our Congress consists of 435 members. So the Council of 500 made the decisions, made the laws. Now, something else he set up was when they had the election, the persons who lost were ostracized. Now that might seem strange. Ostracized meant that the person who lost the election, the person who finished second in the election was told he must leave Athens for 10 years and not come within 50 miles of the city, but take his family and go and live somewhere else. And now, if you think this sounds strange, here's why it doesn't. I mean, in a small city-state, oftentimes the political parties will get to where they're so even that on any given day, one of them might win an election by just a few votes. But then once the other man gets in power, he might slip up just a little bit and the political wind go the other way, and it would just be impossible for the winner to function. Well, so they said, what we must do, we must tell the loser he must leave. And then the winner will at least have a chance to function. So if you look at it in that light, it does make some sense. I mean, I've seen in church politics we have two equal parties, and one of them never gets invested because they're all so really even. Well, they would ostracize the leader of the losing party, and that way they, for at least 10 years, and that way the winning party would have a chance to at least govern. Now, this takes us up to, I mean, the development of Greek's history was interrupted by the invasion of the Persians. Now here's the way it happened, or what happened. The Persian Empire had conquered all of what is today Turkey, right across the sea from Greece. But keep in mind, a lot of Greeks had moved into Turkey. Well, the Persians had conquered Turkey, but a lot of the Greeks living in Greece were stirring up rebellion against the Persian government. I mean, getting their cousins and their second and third cousins to hey, you know, we'll support you. And the Persian king found out that it was the Greeks who were keeping these people in Asia Minor. They called it Asia Minor in those days, but the people in what is today Turkey and the rest. So the Persian king decided, hey, I got to conquer Greece also. So the two Persian kings back-to-back sent army. The first one was Darius. And then his son Xerxes also sent him. So basically the Greeks had to fight the Persians twice. Anyway, Darius sent his army, thinking it would be an easy conquest. Darius was defeated at the Battle of Marathon. Now, the word marathon is used today. Marathon is 26 miles from Athens. Now, in the story of the marathon, one of the more famous stories was there was a runner named Thucydides. Thucydides had won the olive leaf crown for winning the Olympics. In those days, every Olympic person competed in everything. Well, Thucydides won because he could outrun everybody else. He was the fastest runner. Well, when the Persians arrived, Thucydides was told to run from one city to another to tell them to assemble and fight the Persians. Well, Thucydides had to run 150 miles. Now, folk, in my way of thinking, I think they could have exempted him from fighting the battle marathon. I mean, anybody could, but it said he had to fight the battle marathon. So he ran 150 miles to assemble the Greeks. Then he fought in the battle marathon. Then, since he survived the marathon, they said, you run to Athens. So he ran to 26 miles to Athens, got to the public square, and was able to get out the words, victory is ours. And he fell down dead. And from that day to this, our runners will run the marathon, and yes, the marathon is 26 miles, to duplicate the feat of Thucydides. But of course, none of our runners will have run 150 miles in preparation and fought a battle with their swords, and then run the 26 miles afterward. But Thucydides could not quite do it. He died, but he felt duty bound. He would not quit, would not rest. All right, well, Darius went home in defeat. The next king, Xerxes, sent another army to conquer the Greeks. the Greeks decided to fight on two fronts, the land and on the sea. The Persians won on land, and the Persians went to Athens, and the city of Athens was sacked. Now, folks, maybe this is the best thing that happened to Athens. Athens was destroyed. If you recall this American history, General Sherman went through Atlanta and burned the city of Atlanta to the ground. He said, I regret burning this beautiful city, but I know these people that when I'm gone, they'll rebuild another city after this one more beautiful than the one destroyed, which the Atlanta people did. Well, the Athenian people, well, in the 1890s, a great fire occurred in Chicago. We called it the Great Chicago Fire. And the people of Chicago built a more beautiful city in place than the one that was destroyed. Same with Athens. Athens was sacked, but they rebuilt the city. Well, now then they met at a place called Thermopylae, and I'm fast running out of time. Now, Thermopylae is a pass surrounded on each side by a tall hill. The Spartans had 300 men, and they met the Persians at this pass. And again, the Spartans were standing shield to shield, and there was a movie made of this called The 300. Did any of you happen to see it? I almost bought it one time, and regret not. A couple of you nodding your heads and you saw the movie. But they fought shoulder to shoulder, but the Greeks had a traitor among them. And this traitor showed the Persian army a way to get around behind. Now that was one of the weaknesses of the hoplite. If you could ever get around their flank, you could whip them. If you could ever be behind, you could do it. Because they were so trained that they would not even turn around when they knew they were being stabbed. Also, these soldiers only covered the front. They left their back spare. And again, the idea was you always keep the enemy in front of you, because only your front is protected. If you turn around, you can be hit from behind. So it discouraged them from running. It also made their armor lighter.
What's the name of the pass?
The pass was Thermopylae, T-H-E-R. The Spartan king's name was Leonidas. Don't worry about that, but the Spartans were defeated. They fought to the last man. All 300 were killed at the Battle of Thermopylae after a traitor had showed them a way around the pass. However, the Battle of Salamis was a different story. The Battle of Salamis, it was a navy battle in which the Athenian navy engaged the Persians. The Athenian ships were better, faster, and more maneuverable. Now, I'll close with this. The Greeks told a story that one of their scientists named Archimedes had a concave mirror in which he shone. Now, some of you as kids might have played with a magnifying glass where you'd use the sun's rays to set some paper on fire or set some dry leaves on fire. But supposedly he had a concave mirror that focused the sun's rays on the Persian ships and set the Persian ships on fire. I say supposedly, because in the modern world, our scientists have tried it, and we didn't. I'm not saying they didn't. It was believed for a long time that they did, but we have tried it, and we've tried it with several different kinds of mirrors, put 2 or 3 mirrors together, tried it with several different kinds of wooden ships. We can't set boats on fire that are in the water. But supposedly, the Greeks did it. Anyway, I'll have to close with that. Well, to make it long, so the Greeks finally defeated the Persians at Plataea. I'll take up with that next time. And the Persians were sent home, never to come back. All right.